The cemetery was quiet that spring morning in 1981. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, sprawling and meticulously maintained, where Hollywood's elite went to rest for eternity. Spencer Tracy had been buried there since 1967, 14 years earlier, and Katharine Hepburn still visited his grave regularly, privately, quietly, alone. Or at least, that was the plan. What happened that morning became one of the most infamous incidents in the ongoing war between celebrities and the photographers who hunted them. It involved a 74-year-old woman, a broken camera, and an act of violence that somehow never resulted in arrest, lawsuit, or any consequence whatsoever. This is the story of the day Katharine Hepburn punched a photographer and got away with it completely. Understanding this story requires understanding what Spencer Tracy's grave meant to Hepburn. For 26 years, she had loved him in secret. For 26 years, she had been the other woman, living in the margins of his life, waiting for moments when he could be hers. When he died in 1967, she hadn't even been allowed at his funeral. Louise Tracy, his wife, had buried him with full Catholic rites, and Hepburn had mourned alone. The grave became the only place where Hepburn could publicly acknowledge her relationship with Tracy, and even then publicly is the wrong word. She would visit early in the morning, before the cemetery filled with tourists and gawkers. She would sit by his headstone, sometimes for hours, talking to him the way she'd talked to him in life. Sharp, funny, brutally honest. It was private communion with the man she'd loved most in the world. And the press knew about it. Of course they knew. Katharine Hepburn, visiting Spencer Tracy's grave, was exactly the kind of human interest story that sold magazines. The tragic romance, the eternal devotion, the lonely widow who wasn't technically a widow. It was irresistible. For years, photographers had tried to capture these visits. Most were deterred by cemetery security or by Hepburn's own vigilance. She would arrive in different cars, at different times, through different entrances. She treated these visits like military operations, planning routes, timing arrivals, doing whatever it took to maintain privacy. But in 1981, one photographer decided he'd had enough of being outsmarted by a 74-year-old woman. He was going to get the shot, no matter what it took. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps deliberately obscured. What's known is that he worked for one of the tabloids that thrived on celebrity candids. He'd been staking out Forest Lawn for weeks, waiting for Hepburn. He'd learned her patterns, identified the entrance she used most often, found the perfect hiding spot with a clear view of Tracy's grave. On this particular morning, his patience paid off. He saw Hepburn's car arrive, watched her walk to the grave, carrying flowers, saw her kneel down, arranging them carefully. This was it. This was the shot that would pay his rent for months. He raised his camera, focused, started shooting. The sound of the shutter gave him away. In the quiet cemetery, the mechanical click-click was as loud as gunfire. Hepburn's head snapped up. She saw him immediately, partially hidden behind a monument about 30 feet away, camera aimed directly at her. What happened next depended on who you asked, but the broad strokes were undisputed. Hepburn stood up. She didn't run. She didn't cry, or plead, or try to hide her face. She walked directly toward the photographer with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision and intended to follow through. The photographer, realizing she was coming for him, did what his instincts told him to do. He kept shooting. She was giving him even better pictures now. The famous Katharine Hepburn, angry, striding toward the camera. This was gold. He was still thinking that when she reached him and punched the camera. Not a slap, not a shove, a punch. Closed fist, full force, directly into the lens. The camera shattered. Pieces of glass and metal scattered across the manicured grass. The photographer stood there, shocked, holding what remained of several $1,000s worth of equipment. Hepburn, according to witnesses, said exactly 3 words, "How dare you?" Then she walked back to Tracy's grave, finished arranging her flowers, and left. The photographer, once he recovered from shock, did what anyone in his position would do. He called the police. This was assault. This was destruction of property. This was Katharine Hepburn committing a crime in front of witnesses, and there would be consequences. Except there weren't. No consequences at all. When the police arrived and took statements, something interesting happened. The cemetery security guards, who had witnessed the incident, gave very vague accounts. They'd been too far away to see clearly. They couldn't be certain what had happened. Maybe the photographer had dropped his camera. Maybe Hepburn had accidentally bumped into him. Their memories were suddenly, conveniently fuzzy. Other visitors to the cemetery that morning also couldn't quite remember the details. It was all very confusing. Things happened so fast, who could say for sure what had occurred? The photographer insisted he had proof that his ruined camera was evidence of assault. The police pointed out that a broken camera only proved the camera was broken, not how it got that way. Did he have witnesses? Well, yes, but none of them seemed to remember things his way. Did he have photographs of the assault? No, because his camera had been destroyed before he could capture that moment. It was, the police suggested, a difficult case to prove. Perhaps he should consider dropping it. He didn't want to drop it. He wanted justice. He wanted his camera replaced. He wanted Katharine Hepburn to face consequences for attacking him while he was just doing his job. But then the phone calls started. From the cemetery, suggesting that perhaps he'd been trespassing in areas he shouldn't have been. From his employer, mentioning that lawsuits involving Katharine Hepburn tended to generate publicity and not always the kind that helped tabloid photographers. From his lawyer, explaining that proving assault when you were photographing someone at a private gravesite without permission was going to be very, very expensive. Within a week, the photographer had quietly dropped all complaints. The broken camera was written off as a business expense. The incident was never officially reported as a crime. It simply disappeared, as if it had never happened. But it had happened, and in Hollywood, stories like this don't stay buried. Within days, everyone in the industry knew. Katharine Hepburn had punched a photographer at Spencer Tracy's grave and faced zero consequences. The story spread through studios, agencies, and production companies with a mixture of shock and admiration. The public reaction, when it inevitably leaked to the press, was fascinating. This was 1981, an era when celebrity culture was becoming increasingly aggressive. Paparazzi were getting more intrusive. Celebrities were losing privacy at an accelerating rate. And here was Katharine Hepburn, Hollywood royalty, literally fighting back. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. Letters poured into her Connecticut home. People praised her for standing up to invasive photographers, for protecting something sacred, for refusing to let the press turn even her grief into entertainment. A few voices criticized her, of course. She'd committed assault, she'd destroyed property, she'd used her wealth and fame to avoid consequences that an ordinary person would have faced. All of this was true, but the court of public opinion didn't care. The photographer had been stalking a 74-year-old woman at a cemetery. He'd been photographing her private moment of grief. Most people felt he got exactly what he deserved. Hepburn herself never publicly commented on the incident. Not in interviews, not in her later autobiography, not in any public forum. As far as she was concerned, it didn't warrant discussion. Someone had violated her privacy at the most sacred place in her life, and she'd responded. End of story. But the incident said something profound about power, privacy, and privilege in Hollywood. Because the truth is, Katharine Hepburn got away with punching that photographer, not because what she did was legal, but because of who she was. Her connections ran deep through Hollywood and Los Angeles society. Cemetery officials owed favors to studios she'd worked with. Police officials had family members who'd worked on her films. The entire infrastructure bent toward protecting her. An unknown actress who punched a photographer would have been arrested, charged, convicted. But Katharine Hepburn, 4 Oscars, Hollywood royalty for 50 years. For her, the rules bent. Was this fair? Absolutely not. Was it justice? Hardly. But it was reality. And it revealed something uncomfortable about how celebrity privilege operates, even when the celebrity is in the right morally, but wrong legally. The photographer, in the aftermath, became a cautionary tale. Other paparazzi heard the story and took note. Forest Lawn became essentially off-limits for celebrity grave photography. The unspoken rule became you could photograph celebrities almost anywhere, but not there, not then, not like that. Hepburn had drawn a line, violently and effectively, and Hollywood, for once, agreed with her. What made the incident particularly interesting was its timing. This was 1981, 14 years after Tracy's death. Why did she snap on this particular morning? Friends suggested it might have been the accumulation of years of intrusion. Every violation adds weight until something breaks. Or perhaps on that particular morning, she'd simply had enough. Enough of performing her grief for strangers, enough of having her most private moments turned into content. There's also the factor of Spencer Tracy himself. Hepburn had spent 26 years making herself small for him, living in shadows, accepting invisibility. The grave was the one place where she could claim him, where she could be openly his. Having that space invaded, that final private connection photographed and commodified, was perhaps the one violation too far. The punch wasn't random violence, it was the explosion of decades of compressed rage at being watched, judged, photographed, and consumed. It was every time she'd smiled for cameras she didn't want to smile for. All of that concentrated into one moment of pure fury, and she got away with it because sometimes the powerful protect their own. The incident also highlighted the ongoing tension between public interest and private grief. The photographer would have argued that Katharine Hepburn was a public figure, that her relationship with Spencer Tracy was newsworthy, that photographing her at his grave was legitimate journalism. Hepburn would have countered that her grief was not entertainment, that there had to be some spaces, some moments, that remained private even for public figures, that a cemetery should be sacred ground where cameras didn't belong. Both positions have merit, which is why celebrity privacy remains unresolved decades later. But in that moment, Hepburn's fist settled the argument in her favor. The destroyed camera became something of a legend itself. Some claimed it was eventually repaired and sold to a collector. Others said it was thrown away, too damaged to salvage. The photographer himself disappeared from the tabloid scene shortly after. Whether by choice or because he'd been blacklisted was never clear. What is clear is that after 1981, photographs of Katharine Hepburn at Spencer Tracy's grave became extremely rare. When they did appear, they were distant, respectful, clearly taken from far away. The message had been received: get too close and there would be consequences. For Hepburn, the incident must have been satisfying on some level. She'd spent a lifetime being controlled, managed, directed, told what to wear, how to behave, what to say. She'd fought those constraints her entire career, but there were always limits. Except apparently, if you were Katharine Hepburn and you'd earned enough goodwill over 50 years, sometimes you could. Sometimes the rules didn't apply. Sometimes fury was allowed its expression and the system would look the other way. This wasn't justice. It was privilege, but it was also, in its way, deeply human. A woman protecting the one private space she had left. A person pushed too far, finally pushing back. An individual asserting that some things, some places, some moments were off limits, and enforcing that boundary with her fists. The cemetery incident became part of Hepburn lore, told and retold in various forms. In some versions, she broke the photographer's nose. In others, she destroyed multiple cameras. None of these escalations were true, but they spoke to what people wanted to believe, that Katharine Hepburn was fierce enough, powerful enough to completely destroy anyone who crossed her most sacred boundaries. The reality was simpler and somehow more powerful. She punched a camera, she broke it, she walked away, and everyone who could have stopped her decided not to. Because sometimes the powerful protect their own. And sometimes that protection extends to acts of violence when the powerful believe the violence was justified. Was it right? That's a complicated question. Was it understandable? Absolutely. Did it work? Completely. After that morning in 1981, Katharine Hepburn visited Spencer Tracy's grave in peace for the rest of her life. The photographer got a broken camera and a story he couldn't sell. Hepburn got her privacy back, violently reclaimed and fiercely defended. And Forest Lawn Memorial Park got an unspoken rule that everyone understood: leave the grieving alone, especially when the grieving person is Katharine Hepburn. She continued visiting Spencer Tracy's grave until she became too frail to make the trip. In her 90s, when asked about Tracy, she would sometimes talk about their films together, their partnership, what he meant to her work. But the visits to his grave remained private, protected by that single act of violence that everyone agreed to forget officially while remembering it completely. When Katharine Hepburn died in 2003, at age 96, some expected her to be buried next to Tracy. She wasn't. She was cremated, and her ashes scattered in the Connecticut locations she loved. Even in death, she maintained the pattern of their relationship, near him, but never officially together. The photographer from that morning in 1981 was never identified in any official capacity. His broken camera was never compensated. His story was never told in any outlet that mattered. He existed only as an anonymous antagonist in someone else's legend, the man who got too close and paid the price. And Katharine Hepburn remained what she'd always been: complicated, contradictory, fierce, and utterly unwilling to be controlled by anyone or anything, including the laws that would have arrested anyone else for doing exactly what she did.